Hi there, my name is Drew Nicholson. Welcome to my channel Remembering Love, and I'd like to today examine some of the myths and some of the questions and some of the problems I think essentially with this understanding of we need to love ourselves or we should love ourselves. So we're going to get into that very soon. If you're new to this channel, this is a channel where we explore the subjects of healing childhood trauma, CPTSD, and all the various things in and around that. If you like that kind of content, you just have to click on the like and subscribe button here and you'll be updated every week with the new videos that I put out. If you're not new to this channel and you've come here again to watch another video, thank you very much for coming back. Now in this video, I would like to explore what I think is a really interesting and I think a little bit unexamined subject, which is the subject of self-love and the way it's prescribed as a kind of a cure-all to our trauma and our healing process, I think is done in a way that I think there is a lack of thought a little bit, or a lack of consideration in what it really means. And in this video I'd like to explore a number of different things. One, like what is it to self-love? Like what are we really talking about? When we deconstruct the process of loving oneself, what is really involved in that? And I think when we look under the bonnet of that, we see there are some issues contained in that are problematic. So I'd like to look at what are those issues. Why is it so hard? Why is it something that's just so easily put out there, but when it comes to the actuality of doing it, it feels like it's a lot more elusive and harder than maybe Instagram seems to kind of make out. And then what I'd like to look at is not what are the alternatives, but how does self-love arise? Like what are the conditions that self-love emerges from, if there are conditions, and is there an alternative path towards self-love that doesn't start with self-love? And I'll kind of go into the details of that as well. But to begin with, when we talk about self-love, I think for someone that's been on this healing journey a long time, I've been reading self-help books for a very long time, the question of we need to love ourselves, or you need to love yourself, or I should love myself more, is almost at a point where it's just taken as a given. It's so ubiquitous in terms of what we see online, what we see on Facebook, Instagram, self-help books. It is just assumed that it's a good thing. To love yourself is something everyone needs to do. And I'm not here to say you shouldn't, and I'm not here to say you shouldn't love yourself, but I'm here to like to really examine, like when that's said, it's said in such a flippant, cavalier kind of way, like you should love yourself, but what does that even mean, and how is that possible, and what's really going on here? And it's important to understand language is critical, like the way we frame things, and I've talked about this in a lot of videos, the framing we give to our issues impacts how we come at our issues and the way we approach our issues. And this question of you should love yourself taken as a given, I do think is problematic. It's also important to understand that the way we see things is part of a cultural phenomena, that the nature of loving oneself and you need to love yourself is part of our culture. It's arisen out of a cultural milieu rather than it's just that's always being talked about. And pop psychology's been there for all eternity. Self-help's been there for all eternity. It hasn't. 500 years ago, the idea of self-love was considered bad. The idea was within Christian Europe, you had to love God and love your neighbor, and self-love was seen as a form of vanity or narcissism. And if anything, you have to do the opposite of that. You have to think of God before you thought of yourself. I'm sure if you went into indigenous cultures and talked about how they needed to love themselves, maybe that would just seem like crazy. Maybe that was just a given and that was already there. So the need to self-love has come from a response to a lot of trauma. It's come from a lot of an emergence of shame and self-hatred, and a build-up over hundreds of years of this psychological angst that we have. And self-love is a kind of rebalancing of that, or a remedy to that. So it's also important to understand this emergence of the emphasis on self-love is a cultural and social response to our condition in the Western world. It isn't just part of our humanity, it's this moment in time. So what I'd like to look at is when someone says to you, or you read that you should love yourself, what is involved in that? And I'm going to look at this through the lens of my own experience, that I have put that upon myself as a thing that I should do for a very long time in a way that really just goes unquestioned. And I'd like to question that, to look and say, well, when I say to myself, I should love myself more, I need to love myself more, what does that mean? So the first thing is, when you set up the frame of this question, I need to love myself more. So if we take out the word, we leave the words I and myself, what we see then is there are two positions. There is I, meaning me, and we're assuming it's a loving factor in me, or a loving part of myself that can love, that can generate love, should love myself, which is another part of myself that doesn't love itself, that hates itself or loathes itself, or feels riddled with shame. So when I say I need to love myself, what I'm really saying is one part of me that does feel love needs to direct, like sort of the Care Bear, that love towards another part of me that doesn't. Okay, so, but if I don't already love myself and I'm needing to love myself, then contained in that very reality is the fact that I don't feel that. Like the I that's meant to love myself, if that was already there and was already generating love, then I wouldn't need that love in the first place. So there's a weird problem here when it comes to loving oneself, in the sense that when you deconstruct it and you take it apart, it creates this separation inside of us between the part of us that should love ourselves or needs to be loved, and this other part that we assume can love ourselves. So that's one thing to be aware of. And I'm not saying this is wrong or it's right, but it's worth looking at and saying, well, how am I meant to love myself if I don't love myself? Where's the part of me that's meant to come in? And this is where then we move on to the next kind of issue contained in the issue of loving oneself, is the should part of it and I need to part of it. So one of the things that I think is important is when we create a position which is I need to do this, I should do that, it's worth looking at what's the feeling behind that motivation. And when you say to yourself, I need to love myself more, or I should love myself more, or someone says you should love yourself more, built in that is a very subtle opposition. So that's the first thing. There's an element there of, to love myself more means there is something wrong with me. There is something at fault. And that thing at fault is I don't love myself enough. I'm too negative. I have this inner critic. I feel this shame. And I shouldn't feel that. I should feel good. I should feel kind. I should feel loving towards myself. So there is the me that shouldn't be and the me that should be. And to move and transition from the me that shouldn't be to the me that should be, I have to generate self-love towards it. So immediately when you start to see that, there's a feeling of, behind the need to love myself more is a feeling of there is something wrong with me. There is something at fault. There is something in my interior space that shouldn't be there. And the way I get rid of that thing that shouldn't be there is I need to generate self-love. I need to love myself more. If I love myself enough, fully enough, clearly enough, and I take self-loving actions, then the aspect that doesn't love myself will be dissolved, will be healed, will be transcended. So that to me is a little bit problematic, because it immediately, there's a feeling behind I need to love myself, which is embedded with a very subtle fear that if I don't love myself, that if I'm unable to love myself, all these things that shouldn't be going on, the dysfunctional relationships I seem to attract, the addiction cycles I'm caught in, the narcissistic abuser that I can't get away from, the inability to find fulfilling work, whatever it may be, my weight, etc., etc., etc. All these things that arise from a lack of self-love, that if I don't remove that, then my life will continue in this destructive and terrible way. And the antidote, solution, is to love myself. And therefore we create this separation and this sense of, the unloving self versus the loving self. The I should love myself. And buried within that is a subtle fear that if I don't do this thing, self-loving, then I'm not going to be happy, and I'm going to be stuck this way, and I kind of need to love myself. I better love myself or else. And it may not be said in that way, but in my own life, when I examine my own life and I look at all the things I've done to make myself like myself more, or love myself more, I've radically transformed a lot of aspects of my life, from addiction to work to losing weight to whatever it may be. And to all intents and purposes, I'm so far away from where I was, I should, by all measure, love myself more, because I've done the things I should do to love myself more. And yeah, I have less shame, I have less guilt. I'm not caught in a horrible addictive cycle, and as a result of that, I do feel better, sort of, about myself. But there is an elusive, unattainable aspect of arrival that no matter what I do, no matter how much I amend, change, adjust, and improve my life, it remains out there. It remains a carrot on a stick for me. So there comes a point where self-love becomes a feeling of a very subtle chore. It becomes a thing I must do to get rid of this aspect of myself that I don't like, this unloving aspect of myself, this shameful aspect, this critical aspect. And I need to love myself more. So when I feel shame or negative, there is a resistance to that. There's a feeling, hang on, that's not me loving myself. I need to pull myself up by my self-loving bootstraps and get on and love myself more. There's a shouldness. I need to, an urgency and anxiety. And I think to arrive at a point where we are able to let that go, to say, well, it's not that I'm not going to love myself, but that it can't be a should, or I must, or I need to. That if we take that out of it, then it's a different question. It's reframed in a different way. And we start to see it more in terms of what are the causes and conditions in my life, in my interior world, that love arises from naturally. Like what's my original nature? What's my true nature? Because it's one of the things that I think this whole healing journey is a process of, is restoring and regaining our sense of our original nature, our true nature, in the sense of feeling relaxed, feeling like everything's okay, feeling we're at ease, feeling like we can flow, feeling like we're not worried, the childlike aspect that we lose along the way, of just feeling at ease with ourselves, with the world, with our environment, with our interior space, independent of whether we like it, or whether it's pleasurable, or whether it's something we want to push away, but how we arrive at a point where we are accepting of what arises in us, including self-hatred, including self-criticism. So the challenge on one level is to look and say, how do I just accept what is, rather than, I need to love myself more. How do I just be present with what is there, and trusting that as I return to that original relaxed place where I'm able to be with what's there, that love that we're looking for, that love that we want to generate or that we feel is lacking, arises naturally. It arises in a relaxed position. And therefore self-love becomes an outcome of something else, rather than this objective, this goal, this sort of part of our to-do list. That when we're in a relaxed, at ease, serene space, where we're accepting of the content of our consciousness, we're accepting of what moves in and out of our interior space, there is a natural compassion and kindness and care towards that we don't have to attain, that we don't have to acquire or generate more of. But it's a little bit challenging, because I think I've always imagined that I've always had this framework, which is, I need to love myself more, that I'm very self-hating and self-loathing, and I need to gradually kind of move that from, 90% to, more and more down, and that gets, the self-love generates more, and I end up more full of self-love, and all this self-loathing's diminished. And gradually, I think I'm starting to understand that it doesn't seem to quite work that way, and that a more doable approach isn't to love myself more or to generate self-love, but to practice self-acceptance, and to practice being present with what arises and what comes in and what comes out, and to take a relaxed posture, to feel like my interior space is hospitable to whatever may or may not pass through it, including self-criticism. And trusting in that process, trusting that awareness, trusting in that listening, observing aspect of oneself, of holding space for whatever is there, rather than trying to delete or extricate or take away the parts that really I don't like. And that, I think, is one of the things when it comes to self-love, that I think for me at least, when I examine my motive, the drive behind I need to love myself more, there is an anxiety in it. There is, I need to do this, or I'll keep feeling these bad feelings, and I don't want to feel these bad feelings. I want to feel these good feelings, and the way to get rid of these bad feelings is to generate more of these good feelings, self-love, self-kindness, and then I'll get rid of these bad feelings. I'll feel better, and my life will be different. But it's a little bit sort of the horse before the cart before the horse. That first, what's required is just, here I am. Here it is. Here is this anxiety. Here is this self-hatred. And as I'm with it, as I'm able to be present with that, that is the condition from which, weirdly enough, love arises. Like what are the conditions internally where love arises? For me, for the world, for nature. Like what generates love? Like, where does love come from? And the idea that we can switch on a loving part of us to dissolve an unloving part of us doesn't seem to match the reality of how love arises. Where does love arise from? Where are we when love arises? What's going on inside of us? What's the space from which love arises? And to work to occupy that space, to be with that space, to hold that space, to me is a more productive way to work through some of the negativity that, we all want to get rid of, in inverted commas. We all want to transcend deeply negative patterns and addiction processes, or thought forms of self-hatred, for sure. So I'm not saying that we need to be amplifying and going into these things, but there is a subtle nuance of self-acceptance is a different feeling than self-love. Like, I need to love myself more is different to, I just need to be accepting of what's going on in me, whether I like it or not, whether it feels like I want to push it away, or I want to bring it in closer. Like, I'm just trying to be present with what's present. And in that space, in my experience, love does tend to arise in more of a natural, effortless way, and it's not something we generate. It's just something that, as we return to this natural, relaxed, at peace state, it arises in its own natural, in peace kind of way. So look, I hope this has helped. I hope this has given you some insight and some inspiration. If you've got any comments or anything you'd like to share about your own experiences of self-love, or anything we've discussed here in this video, please put them in the comments below. If you've liked this video, please click on the like and subscribe button. You'll get updates every week. Thank you very much for coming here. Please take care of yourself, and bye-bye.